In the heart of a ferocious blizzard in Wyoming's untamed wilderness, where icy winds slice through flesh and darkness swallows all hope, a war-scarred veteran stumbled upon a chilling secret. Two wolf pups, frail and trembling, were left abandoned by a frozen stream, mere breaths from death. A man who thought he'd lost all purpose had no idea that saving them would draw him into a shocking truth buried deep in the snow's faint tracks. Will his compassion be enough to face the lurking shadows? Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. Ice and dust, blurring the horizon where the gray sky met the frozen earth. Temperatures had plummeted far below zero, locking the ground in a brittle crust that seemed to repel life itself. Tufts of dry grass, defiant against the snow, poked through in patches, trembling in the gusts and whispering a faint rustle that was swallowed by the wind's roar. The road wound through a landscape of stark beauty, flanked by rolling hills that faded into the distance, their outlines softened by the brutal storm's haze. No birds sang, no animals stirred. The world felt as if it had been abandoned, left to the mercy of winter's grip. Scattered across the snow were faint traces of something wild, paw prints, barely discernible, etched into the drifts like ghosts of a forgotten presence. Strands of gray fur clung to the grass, snagged by the wind's cruel finger. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of pine branches colliding in the dense forest that loomed far beyond the road, a dark wall separating this forsaken place from the rest of the world. The isolation was palpable, a heavy weight that pressed against the chest, as if the land itself warned travelers to turn back. No cars passed, no voices called. The road was a void, a place where time seemed to pause, indifferent to human concerns. A single set of tire tracks, fresh and jagged, cut through the snow, veering off toward a shallow ditch beside the road. The marks were too deliberate, too abrupt, as if someone had stopped in haste and fled just as quickly. The air held a stillness that felt unnatural, a hush that hinted at a disruption in the land's quiet rhythm. The dim light from the overcast sky cast long shadows, amplifying the sense of cold desolation. It was a scene primed for an encounter, a moment where the ordinary could shatter into something extraordinary. This lonely road was more than a path through the wilderness. It was a crossroads of faith, where the threads of man and nature would soon intertwine. In the heart of this frozen solitude, a spark of compassion was about to ignite, defying the harsh indifference of the elements. The stage was set, the silence poised to break, as the story of a man and two lost souls waited to unfold. A tale of redemption and sacrifice was about to begin, born from the snow and the shadows of Wyoming's untamed hills. Luke Whitaker's old pickup rattled along the dirt road, its engine grumbling against the cold. The world outside was a blur of white and gray, the snow falling heavier now, clinging to the windshield before the wipers swept it away. Luke, 40 years old and carrying the weight of a war he couldn't forget, gripped the steering wheel with hands that never quite stopped trembling. His eyes, shadowed by sleepless nights, scanned the road ahead, though his mind was elsewhere, back in the deserts of Afghanistan, where the screams of his squad still echoed in his dreams. Post-traumatic stress disorder had carved deep lines into his face, making him look older than his years. He lived alone in a rusted trailer tucked away in a remote valley, avoiding people, avoiding memories. Today he'd only ventured out to fix a neighbor's generator, a rare act of obligation that left him drained. Now he just wanted to get home, to shut out the world and the nightmares that haunted him. He pulled over to the side of the road, the truck's tires crunching snow as it came to a stop. His breath fogged in the cab and he rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the fog of exhaustion. Emily, his late wife, flickered in his thoughts. Her warm smile, her gentle hands that once brought light to his darkness. She'd been gone 3 years, taken by cancer, and the hole she left was a wound that refused to heal. Luke leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, when a sharp sound jolted him upright. A vehicle, a black SUV, had screeched to a halt just up the road. The door slammed and through the snow Luke caught a glimpse of a figure moving quickly near a dip. Something was tossed into the snow and then the SUV roared off, its taillights vanishing into the brutal storm. Luke's heart raced, his instincts honed by years in combat kicking in. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his voice rough from disuse. The suddenness of it, the urgency, stirred an unease deep in his gut. His fingers tightened on the wheel and for a moment he considered driving on, letting the incident fade like the tire tracks in the snow. but curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, tugged at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had just happened wasn't right. With a grunt, he shifted the truck into gear and eased forward, following the fresh tracks to the ditch. In the shallow trench, half buried in snow and mud, were two tiny shapes, barely. Luke's breath caught as he leaned closer, squinting through the flurry. They were wolf pups, their gray fur matted with ice, their bodies trembling against the cold. One had a scratched ear, dry blood crusting its fur, likely from a desperate scramble in the ditch. Their eyes were squeezed shut, their breaths shallow, each exhale a faint puff in the freezing air. A soft, pitiful whine escaped one, a sound so weak it seemed to beg for life itself. They were no bigger than kittens, fragile and on the edge of death. Luke crouched, his knees sinking into the snow, and stared at the scene. The ditch was littered with clues: a torn burlap sack, scuff marks, and the faint outline of boot prints. It looked like the work of poachers, or worse, someone who'd attacked a wolf pack and left these pups to die. The thought twisted in Luke's chest, a mix of anger and sorrow. He knew wolves roamed these hills, their howls a familiar sound in the night. But to see such young ones abandoned felt like a betrayal of the land itself. The SUV's hushed retreat suggested guilt, a cruel act done in secret, leaving these creatures to a frozen grave. Luke's mind raced. He wasn't a stranger to loss. Emily, his squad, the life he'd once known, but this was different. These pups were innocent, their lives hanging by a thread. He thought of Emily, how she'd nursed injured animals back to health, her heart too big for the world's cruelty. "What would you do, Emily?" he whispered, his voice lost in the wind. The pup's faint whines pierced the silence. He couldn't walk away, not this time. Luke sat frozen in the snow, his breath forming clouds that drifted into the gray sky. The wind bit at his face, but he barely felt it. His eyes locked on the wolf pups in the ditch. Their tiny bodies, curled together for warmth, seemed to shrink with each passing second. The scratched ear of one pup glistened with dried blood, and the other's chest barely rose with each labored breath. They were dying, and Luke knew. His heart pounded, a familiar panic creeping in, the kind that came with gunfire and chaos, the kind that had followed him home from Afghanistan. His hands shook, not just from the cold, but from the weight of what he'd stumbled upon. The sound of the SUV still echoed in his mind, its abrupt stop and hasty departure replaying like a warning. He glanced at the tire tracks, already blurring under fresh snow, and the torn sack nearby. Whoever had done this didn't want to be seen, didn't want these pups to survive. Luke's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough abandonment in his life. Comrades left behind, promises broken, but this was something else. It was deliberate, cold, and it stirred a fire in him he thought had long burned out. He stood, his boots crunching as he paced back to the truck, his mind a battlefield of doubt and instinct. "Just drive away," he muttered, slamming a fist against the hood. "This ain't your fight." But the image of the fragile pups, their faint whines, clung to him like shrapnel. He opened the truck door, then stopped, his gaze drifting back to the ditch. But it also sharpened his senses. There were no signs of an adult wolf nearby, no tracks, no howls. These pups were truly alone, and time was running out. Luke's thoughts turned to Emily. She'd always been the one to act, to save what others overlooked. He remembered her cradling a wounded deer, her hands steady even when hope was slim. "Do what's right, Luke, even if it hurts," she'd said once. Her voice cut through the fog of his fear, grounding him. He couldn't save his squad, couldn't save Emily, but maybe, just maybe, he could save these pups. He leaned into the truck, rummaging through the cluttered back seat. His fingers closed around a worn wool blanket, stiff with age, and a half-empty bag of jerky he'd forgotten about. It wasn't much, but it was something. He tore open the jerky, breaking it into small pieces, his mind racing for a way to feed them. Wolves ate meat, not milk, but these pups were too weak to chew. He'd have to figure it out. Luke returned to the ditch, kneeling beside the fragile pup. Their whines had grown fainter, their bodies colder. "Come on, little ones," he whispered, wrapping the blanket around them. The stronger pup twitched, its tongue flicking out to taste the air. The other pup didn't move, its breathing so shallow Luke feared it was too late. He looked around, half expecting a wolf pack to emerge from the trees, but the hills were silent. The absence of a mother confirmed his worst fear. These pups had been abandoned, left to die by someone who saw them as nothing more than a burden. Luke's throat tightened. He knew he should call wildlife services, let the professionals handle it, but his time in the army had taught him to distrust systems. Too often they failed the vulnerable. What if they deemed the fragile pups too weak to save? What if they were caged? Or worse? No, he said aloud, his voice firm, not on my watch. The decision settled over him like a weight, heavy but certain. He couldn't trust anyone else to give these pups a chance. PDS or not, he was all they had. Luke scooped them up, cradling their fragile bodies against his chest, and carried them to the truck. Scout, his loyal golden retriever, lifted his head from the passenger seat. He knew he could do it. Easy boy, Luke said, placing the fragile pups on the back seat. Scout sniffed them, then settled beside them, his warmth a silent promise of protection. Luke slid into the driver's seat, his hands steady for the first time that day. He didn't know where he was going yet, only that he had to keep them alive. The engine roared to life and the truck pulled onto the road, leaving the ditch and its secrets behind. For the first time in years, Luke felt a purpose, however fleeting, guiding him through the brutal storm. Luke's truck rumbled through the thickening snow, the heater groaning as it fought the chill seeping through the cracked windows. The wolf pups lay wrapped in the blanket on the back seat, their faint whines barely audible over the wind. Scout remained curled beside them, his golden fur a stark contrast to their matted gray coats. Luke's eyes flipped to the rearview mirror, checking on them every few seconds, as if they might vanish if he looked away too long. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, the weight of his decision pressing harder with each mile. He was no veterinarian, no expert on wolves. What the hell was he doing? The ditch replayed in his mind, the torn sack, the tire tracks, the fragile pup's desperate struggle. Someone had wanted them gone, and the thought made Luke's blood boil. He'd seen cruelty before, in war and in peace, but this was different. These were innocents, left to freeze in a world that didn't care. His thoughts drifted to Emily, her voice echoing through the haze of his relentless peak. Do what's right even if it hurts. She'd believed in second chances, in fighting for the helpless. Luke had lost that belief somewhere in the desert, but now, with 2 lives depending on him, he felt it stirring again. He glanced at the jerky in his lap, now softened with water from a spare bottle. It wasn't ideal, but it was all he had. He reached back, careful not to startle Scout, and held a small piece near the stronger pup's nose. The pup's tongue flicked out, slow at first, then more eagerly, its eyes cracking open to reveal a faint glimmer of life. That's it, Luke murmured, a flicker of hope warming his chest. The weaker pup, though, remained still, its breathing so faint he could barely see it. Luke's stomach twisted. Hang on, little one, just hang on. The road stretched on, a ribbon of white through the hills, and Luke's mind churned with doubt. Calling wildlife services was still an option, but the thought made him uneasy. He'd seen how systems worked, bureaucracy, budget cuts, decisions made by people who didn't care. These pups were too weak for a cage, too young for a fight. He imagined them being put down, deemed unsaleable, and the idea was unbearable. No, he'd made his choice. He'd keep them alive, even if it meant breaking every rule he knew. Luke's thoughts turned to his weather-beaten trailer, a rusted haven in a secluded valley not far from here. It wasn't much, a single room with a fireplace, a cot and a few supplies, but it was warm, isolated and safe. If he could get the fragile pups there, he could buy them time, figure out what to do next. The idea felt reckless, even insane, but it was the only plan on me, he said, his voice low but resolute. The truck hit a rut, jostling the fragile pups, and Luke slowed, cursing under his breath. Scout shifted, pressing closer to the fragile pups, his calm presence a stark contrast to Luke's racing heart. The dog's quiet strength steadied him, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this. Luke reached over, scratching Scout's ears. We're in this together, boy, he said, managing a faint smile. Outside the snow fell harder, obscuring the road ahead. Luke didn't know how long he could keep the fragile pups alive, or what he'd do if their mother never came, but for now, he had a destination and a purpose. The trailer was his best shot, a place where he could fight for them, just as Emily would have. He pressed the gas, the truck plowing through the brutal storm, carrying 2 fragile lives, and a man who was starting to believe he could still make a difference. Luke Whitaker's truck groaned as it navigated the rutted dirt road, the snow falling thicker now, piling against the windshield, in clumps that the wipers struggled to clear. The headlights cast a feeble glow, barely piercing the swirling white that enveloped the Wyoming hill. Luke's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale against the worn leather, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. On the back seat, the 2 wolf pups lay wrapped in an old wool blanket, their faint whines swallowed by the howl of the wind outside. Scout, his golden retriever, stayed pressed against them, his body a warm shield against the cold that seeped through the truck's cracked windows. Luke's heart thudded, a mix of determination and dread. He didn't know if the fragile pups would survive the night, but he knew he had to get them somewhere safe, somewhere warm. The road twisted deeper into the wilderness, its edges blurring under the snow's relentless assault. Luke leaned forward, squinting to keep the path in sight, his breath fogging in the chilly cab. "Hang in there, little ones," he muttered. His voice could will the fragile pups to keep breathing. He glanced back again, catching Scout's steady gaze, the dog's calm presence a quiet reassurance. The pups hadn't moved much, but the stronger one's chest rose and fell a little more steadily, a fragile sign of life. The weaker pup, though, worried him. Its breaths were so shallow, its body so still. Luke's jaw tightened, pushing the thought away. He couldn't lose them now, not after choosing to fight for them. The road began to narrow, the hills closing in as the truck descended into a secluded valley. Pine trees loomed on either side, their branches heavy with snow, and patches of frozen grass peeped through the drifts, marking the edge of meadow far beyond. The isolation of the place was both a comfort and a Luke had chosen this valley for its solitude, a refuge from the world that had chewed him up and spit him out after a rack. But now, with 2 lives depending on him, the loneliness felt sharper, a reminder of how unprepared he was for this. Yet, as the faint outline of his weather-beaten trailer came into view, a flicker of relief warmed his chest. It wasn't much, but it was home, and it was their best shot. The trailer sat alone in the valley, a rusted relic of metal and memories, its walls scarred by years of wind and snow. Frost clung to the small windows, giving them a ghostly sheen under the dim light of the brutal storm. Luke pulled the truck to a stop, the engine coughing as it idled, and cut the ignition. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the wind's mournful cry. He stepped out, his boots sinking into the snow, and opened the back door of the truck. Scout lifted his head, ears twitching, but didn't move from his post beside the fragile pups. "Good boy," Luke said, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached in, carefully lifting the blanket-wrapped pups, their weight so light it made his throat tighten. They were still alive, but only just. Luke kicked the trailer door open, a blast of cold air rushing in as he crossed the threshold. The interior was sparse, a single room that smelled of old wood and faint traces of jerky. A small fireplace sat against one wall, its grate empty but waiting. A wooden table scarred from years of use held a dented oil lamp, its weak flame casting shadows across the room. An old chair, its upholstery frayed, stood beside a cot piled with blankets. On a shelf above, a silver medal from Afghanistan glinted dully, flanked by a faded photo of Emily, her smile frozen in time. He knelt by the fireplace, setting the fragile pups on a pile of blankets he'd dragged from the cot. Their whines were weaker now, their bodies shivering despite the blanket. Luke's hands moved quickly, piling dry logs into the grate and striking a match. The fire caught slowly, crackling as it grew, its warmth spreading like a promise. Scout padded in, shaking snow from his fur, and settled beside the fragile pups, his body curling protectively around them. Luke watched, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're a better man than me, Scout," he said, scratching the dog's ears. Luke stood, his eyes lingering on the fragile pups. They were weaker than he'd hoped, their fur still matted with ice, their breaths too faint for comfort, but they were alive, and that was enough for now. He thought of Emily, how she'd never given up on anything she loved, and the memory pushed back the doubt creeping in. But he shook his head, forcing the thoughts away. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice firm as much for himself as for the fragile pups. The trailer was their haven, and he'd fight to keep them breathing no matter what it took. The trailer's small fireplace roared now, its flames licking at the logs and casting a golden glow across the room. Luke sat cross-legged on the floor, the wolf pups nestled in the blankets before him. The wind howled outside, rattling the trailer's metal walls, but inside the air was thick with the scent of burning wood and the faint tang of jerky. Lucason's hands, rough from years of labor and war, moved with a care he hadn't known he still possessed, as he prepared to feed the fragile pup. He'd scoured the trailer's meager kitchen, a rickety shelf above the table, and found a small stash of supplies, a few strips of jerky, a tin of dried fish, and a half-empty bottle of water. Luke grabbed his pocket knife, its blade worn but sharp, and began slicing the jerky into fine pieces. On the table he worked methodically, his hands steady despite the tremor that often plagued them. The jerky was tough, meant for long days on the road, but he crumbled it into a tin cup, adding warm water from a kettle he'd heated over the fire. The mixture softened, turning into a crude paste that he hoped the fragile pups could manage. He tested it with his finger, ensuring it wasn't too hot, then carried the cup to the fireplace. Luke knelt beside the stronger pup, its gray fur matted but beginning to dry in the fire's warmth. "Come on, little fighter," he said softly, dipping his finger into the paste and holding it near the pup's nose. The pup stirred, its nostrils twitching, and its tongue flicked out, tasting the mixture. It licked slowly at first, then with more urgency, a soft whine escaping as it opened its eyes wider. They were bright, a pale amber that caught the firelight, and Luke felt a surge of hope. "That's it," he encouraged, his voice barely a whisper. He fed it small amounts, careful not to overwhelm its fragile system, watching as it gained strength with each taste. The weaker pup was another story. Its body was still, its breath so faint, Luke had to lean close to see them. He dipped his finger again, gently parting its lips to place a drop of the paste on its tongue. It didn't respond at first, and Luke's chest tightened, fear clawing at him. "Don't give up on me," he said, his voice cracking. He tried again, massaging the pup's throat with the lightest touch, willing it to swallow. After what felt like an eternity, the pup's tongue moved, a weak lick, and its eyes fluttered open, revealing a dull but living gaze. Luke exhaled, relief washing over him like a wave. "There you go," he murmured, feeding it another drop. It was slow, agonizing work, but both pups were fighting, and that was enough. Scout played his part without being asked. The dog stayed close, his body pressed against the fragile pups, his warmth a constant comfort. When the stronger pup whined or shifted, Scout lifted his head, sniffing gently, as if checking its condition. He never growled, never showed fear, his calm acceptance, a stark contrast to Luke's inner turmoil. "You're a damned saint, Scout," he said, scratching the dog's neck. Scout's presence made the trailer feel less empty, less like a prison of memories. For the first time in years, Luke didn't feel alone, as if Scout was his silent partner in this desperate mission. As the hours passed, Luke's thoughts turned inward, drawn to Emily as they always did in quiet moments. He spoke to her, his voice low, filling the trailer with stories he hadn't told in years. "You remember that bird, Emily?" he said, his eyes on the fire. "The one with the broken wing you found in that storm. You stayed up all night feeding it with a dropper, even when I said it was hopeless." He chuckled, the sound rough but warm. "You proved me wrong, didn't you?" Emily's laughter echoed in his memory, her face bright even through the haze of grief. She'd always been the one to save, to nurture, and now Luke felt her guiding him, her strength flowing through his hands, as he cared for the fragile pups. His PTSD was never far away though. The wind's howl mimicked the screams of war, and more than once, Luke flinched, his heart racing as he mistook the sound for something sinister. The trailer's walls seemed to close in, the shadows flickering like threats, but he forced himself to focus on the fragile pups, their soft whines anchoring him to the present. Saving them felt like atonement, a way to make up for the lives he couldn't save in Afghanistan. Squad, his friends, the innocents caught in the crossfire. "I couldn't help them," he whispered, his voice breaking, "but I can help you." The trailer grew warmer, the fire's glow bathing the room in a soft light that danced across Emily's photo. Luke felt her presence, as if she were watching, her smile urging him on. The crackle of burning logs mingled with the fragile pup's faint whines, creating a fragile symphony of hope. Luke looked at them, seeing the stronger pup shift slightly, its movements stronger now, while the weaker one managed another weak lick. A sense of purpose long buried stirred in him. He hadn't felt this alive in years, not since the war stole his soul and Emily's death took the rest. He leaned back, his back against the wall, and glanced at Scout. "We're not giving up, are we, boy?" he said, his voice steady now. Scout's tail thumped softly, a quiet agreement. Luke's eyes returned to the fragile pups, their tiny forms a reminder of why he was here. The future was uncertain, food was low, The brutal storm was fierce, and he was no expert, but he'd made a promise: he'd keep them alive, honor Emily's legacy, and maybe, just maybe, find a piece of himself along the way. The morning broke with a fragile stillness. The blizzard's fury softened to a gentle drift of snow that dusted the Wyoming valley. Weak sunlight filtered through the thinning mist, casting a pale glow over the frost-covered hills and the rusted trailer where Luke Whitaker had spent the night tending to 2 wolf pups. Inside, the fire in the small fireplace crackled, its warmth a lifeline for the fragile pups, nestled in a pile of blankets. Luke knelt beside them, his cowish hands gently adjusting the blanket around the weaker pup, whose faint whines had grown slightly stronger since the night before. The stronger pup, its amber eyes now open, licked at a scrap of softened jerky Luke had prepared, its movements slow but determined. Scout, the golden retriever, lay close, his body a steady source of heat, his calm presence a quiet anchor in the trailer's sparse interior. Luke's eyes, shadowed by exhaustion and the weight of his PTSD, softened as he watched the fragile pups. They were fighting, and that gave him a flicker of hope, a rare feeling after years of battling nightmares from Afghanistan. He was about to check the fire when a low rumble cut through the morning's quiet, the unmistakable sound of an engine. Luke froze, his heart lurching as the noise grew closer, tires crunching snow just beyond the trailer. His instincts, honed by war, screamed danger. He stood swiftly, moving to the frost-covered window, and peered through a small clear patch. A white pickup truck had stopped about 50 yards away, its exhaust puffing clouds into the cold air. 2 men stepped out, their figures bulky in camouflage hunting gear, one clutching a rifle with a casual grip that sent a chill down Luke's spine. Their eyes scanned the valley, lingering on the trailer, and Luke's pulse quickened, the echo of gunfire from his past ringing in his ear. He backed away from the window, his breath shallow, a familiar panic of PTSD clawing at his chest. "Not now," he muttered, clenching his fists to steady himself. The pups whined softly, sensing the shift in the air, and Luke glanced at them, their vulnerability sharpening his resolve. He didn't know who these men were, hunters, poachers, or something worse, but their presence felt like a threat, a shadow cast over the fragile sanctuary he'd created. The memory of the black SUV, the one that had dumped the fragile pups in the ditch, flashed through his mind. Were these men connected? Had they come looking for the fragile pups, or for him? Luke's hand instinctively reached for the knife in his pocket, though he knew it was no match for a rifle. A loud voice broke the silence outside. "Hey, anyone in there?" One of the men called, his tone cheerful but low with a forced friendliness that set Luke's nerves on edge. He moved to the door, his boots heavy on the trailer's creaking floor, and cracked it open just enough to see the men clearly. The one who'd spoken was tall, with a scruffy beard and a hunter's cap pulled low, his eyes sharp as they studied the trailer. The other, shorter and broader, held the rifle loosely, but his posture suggested he could raise it in an instant. Luke stood in the doorway, blocking their view inside, his broad frame filling the narrow space. "It's me and my dog," he said, his voice low and even, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The bearded man tilted his head, a smile playing on his lips that didn't reach his eye. "Heard there was some trouble out here," he said, his gaze flicking past Luke toward the trailer's interior. "Word is someone found wolf pups on that dirt road a ways back. You seen anything like that?" Luke's grip tightened on the doorframe, his knuckles whitening. The mention of the fragile pups sent a jolt through him, but he kept his face impassive. "Years of military training, haven't seen any wolves," he lied, his tone flat, "just passing through, fixing a generator for a neighbor." The second man, the one with the rifle, stepped closer, his boots crunching snow. "Funny thing," he said, his voice colder. "We got a call on the radio. Someone saw a truck like yours near that ditch right after those pups were dumped." Luke felt sweat bead on his forehead, despite the threatened air, his relentless PTSD amplifying the threat in the man's words. Memories of ambush, of enemies hiding behind false smiles, flooded his mind, urging him to run or fight. But he couldn't, not with the fragile pups inside, not with Scout depending on him to keep things calm. Before Luke could respond, a low growl rumbled from behind him. Scout pushed through the narrow gap in the door, his fur bristling, his lips curled to reveal sharp teeth. The dog planted himself in front of Luke, his eyes locked on the hunters, the growl deepening into a warning that echoed across the valley. The bearded man took a step back, his fake smile faltering, While the rifleman hesitated, his weapon dipping slight, Luke seized the moment, his voice hardening. "Like I said, nothing to see here," he said, his tone carrying an edge of steel. "You're on my land. Time to go." The hunters exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. The rifleman's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise the gun. Scout's growl grew louder, his body tense, ready to lunge if needed. Luke stood his ground, his own fear buried beneath a surge of protectiveness. These men weren't here to help, they were predators, just like whoever had left the fragile pups to die. He wouldn't let them near the trailer, near the fragile lives he'd sworn to save. The bearded man raised his hands in a mock gesture of surrender, his smile returning but strained. "All right, friend," he said, backing toward the truck. "Just checking. Stay warm out here." The rifleman followed, his eyes lingering on Luke a moment longer before he turned away. The truck's engine roared to life, its tires kicking up snow as it pulled away, leaving a trail of exhaust that dissolved into the mist. Luke stood rooted in place, his breath coming in sharp bursts, listening until the sound of the engine faded completely. Only then did he let his shoulders slump, the tension draining from his body like water from a cracked dam. He closed the door, the cold metal solid under his hand, and turned to the fragile pups. They were still there, curled in their blankets, unharmed, their soft whines a reminder of why he'd faced down the hunter. Scout padded back to them, his growl replaced by a gentle nudge, as he settled beside them. His job done, Luke knelt by the fireplace, his hands trembling now that the adrenaline had faded. "Good boy," he whispered, scratching Scout's ears, his voice thick with gratitude. The dog's loyalty had tipped the scales, giving Luke the strength to stand his ground. He looked at the fragile pups, their tiny forms a stark contrast to the danger that had just passed. The hunter's words echoed in his mind. Someone had seen him, knew about the fragile pup. The threat wasn't gone, only delayed, and Luke felt it like a shadow at the edge of his vision. His PTSD made every unknown a potential ambush, but this time he'd protected something worth fighting for. He added a log to the fire, the flames flaring briefly, and sat back, his eyes on the fragile pups. They were safe for now, but the valley no longer felt like a sanctuary. Luke's thoughts churned, weighing the risks of staying versus moving on. He didn't know who the hunters were, or what they wanted, but he knew one thing: he'd do whatever it took to keep the fragile pups alive. Emily's voice, soft and steady, whispered in his memory, "Do what's right," even if it meant Luke nodded to himself, a quiet vow forming in the firelit trailer. He'd made his choice, and he'd see it through, no matter what came next. The afternoon sky over the Wyoming Valley darkened, heavy with clouds that churned like a brewing storm. By late afternoon the blizzard returned with a vengeance, its winds howling through the hills, carrying sheets of snow that buried the dirt road, and sealed the valley in a white shroud. Inside Luke Whitaker's trailer, the walls shuddered under the brutal storm's assault, the small windows rattling in their frames as gusts battered the rusted metal exterior. The fireplace, though stoked with fresh logs, struggled to keep the chill at bay, its flames flickering as drafts slipped through unseen cracks. Luke stood by the fire, his broad shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the two wolf pups nestled in their blanket. Their faint whines, barely audible over the wind's roar, were a fragile reminder of the lives he was fighting to save. Luke turned to the kitchen shelf, his hands moving with a mechanical precision born of necessity. He opened the tin where he'd kept his supplies, his heart sinking as he surveyed the meager contents. Only a few strips of jerky and a small handful of dried fish remained, barely enough for another day, let alone the uncertain future the brutal storm promised. He ran a hand through his graying hair, the weight of their situation pressing down like the snow outside. The trailer was a fortress against the cold, but it was also a trap. The road was impassable, the valley cut off from the world, and Luke knew he and the fragile pups were stranded, with no way to leave, and no help to call. The radio on the table, a relic from his army days, sat silent, its signals drowned by the brutal storm's interference. He was alone, save for Scout and the fragile pups, and the realization tightened his chest. He knelt beside the fragile pups, checking their condition with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior. The stronger pup, its amber eyes now bright with a spark of life, whined softly and nudged the blanket, its movement stronger than the day before. The weaker pup, though still frail, had begun to lick at the jerky paste Luke fed it, its breath steadier, but far from secure. They were surviving, but for how long? Luke's mind spiraled, his Peckle Day, rearing its ugly head, like a beast he could never slay. The wind's howl morphed into the screams of his squad in Afghanistan, the crack of gunfire, the shattering explosions that had stolen his peace. He flinched, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the blanket, his vision blurring with memories of bodies left behind, of lives he couldn't save. Not now, he growled, forcing himself to focus on the fragile pups, their tiny forms grounding him in the present. But the doubts crept in, relentless as the brutal storm. What was he doing, keeping these wild creatures in a trailer? He wasn't a savior, he was a broken man, haunted by failures that followed him like shadows. The pups needed more than he could give, more than jerky in a fight. They needed their pack, their mother, the freedom of the forest. Luke's gaze drifted to the window, where snow piled against the glass, obscuring the world beyond. He'd saved them from the ditch, but was he now holding them captive, dooming them to a life they weren't meant for? The thought twisted in his gut, a knife of guilt that cut deeper than the cold. "Am I hurting you more than helping?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the brutal storm. Luke stood, pacing the small trailer, his boots thudding against the worn floor. The stronger pup let out a louder whine, almost a bark, and scrambled to its feet, its tiny legs wobbling as it tried to chase the blanket's edge. The sight brought a faint smile to Luke's lips, but it also sharpened his realization. These were wolves, not pets. The stronger pup's energy, its instinct to move, to explore, was a reminder of the wildness in its blood. Even the weaker pup, now licking at the jerky with tentative flicks of its tongue, showed signs of a spirit that belonged to the forest, not a man's trailer. Outside, the wind carried a distant sound, a faint mournful howl that pierced the brutal storm's roar. Was it a wolf, a pack? The sound was too far to be sure, but it stirred something in him, a recognition that the pup's true home was out there, beyond the valley's frozen walls. He sat by the fire, his eyes on the fragile pups as they settled back into the blanket. The stronger pup nuzzled its sibling, its warmth a small act of survival, and Luke felt a pang of awe at their resilience. But he couldn't ignore the truth. Keeping them here too long could rob them of their nature, their ability to survive in the wild. If their mother was out there, or their pack, they deserved to be with them, not tethered to a man whose own life was a patchwork of scars. The thought of letting them go was a blade to his heart, but Luke knew it was the right thing. The only memories of Emily flooded back, as they always did when he faced a crossroads. He saw her in his mind's eye, kneeling in the rain to free a bird she'd nursed back to health, its wings trembling as it took flight. "Love means letting go, Luke," she'd said, her voice steady even as tears glistened in her eyes. "Even if it breaks your heart." Luke's throat tightened, and he buried his face in his hands, the warmth of the fire doing little to ease the ache inside. Emily had known the cost of doing what was right, and now Luke faced the same choice. If the pup's mother came, he'd have to open the door, let them return to the wild. Even if it meant never seeing them again, the thought was unbearable, like losing Emily all over again. But he knew it was what she'd want, what the fragile pups needed. Tears slipped down his cheeks, unheeded, as he sat in the flickering light. "I'm not ready to lose you," he whispered to the fragile pups, his voice raw. But the decision was made, a quiet vow etched in his soul. If a wolf appeared, if there was any chance for the fragile pups to rejoin their kind, he'd let them go. It was a promise to them, to Emily, and to the man he was trying to become. He wiped his face, his hands steady now, and stood to check the radio one last time. Static crackled, the brutal storm still blocking any signal, but Luke didn't care. He was on his own, and that was enough. He added another log to the fire, the flames flaring briefly, and knelt beside Scout, who lifted his head with a soft whine. "We'll do what's best for them, boy," Luke said, his hand resting on the dog's fur. Scout's tail thumped once, a silent agreement. Luke looked at the fragile pups, now sleeping, their tiny chests rising and falling in the firelight. A spark of hope flickered in him, fragile but real. The storm raged on, the future uncertain, but for now they were alive, and Luke would fight for them, until the moment came to set them free. He settled back against the wall, his eyes never leaving the fragile pups, ready to face whatever the blizzard and his own demons would bring. The morning after the blizzards peaked, the Wyoming Valley awoke to a fragile calm, the snow falling in soft whispers rather than howling torrents. A pale sun struggled through the thinning clouds, casting a muted glow over the frost-covered hills and the river. Luke stood by the small window, his breath fogging the frost-etched glass, his eyes scanning the valley for any sign of the hunters who'd come the day before. The pups, nestled in their blankets near the fireplace, whined softly,
their strengthening voices a testament to his care. Luke's hand, a movement on the hill caught his eye, and Luke's heart skipped a beat. There, silhouetted against the snow-draped ridge, stood a lone wolf, her silver-gray fur shimmering in the faint sunlight. She was magnificent, her posture regal yet cautious, her ears pricked as she gazed toward the trailer. Luke's breath caught, his fingers tightening on the sill. The wolf raised her head, letting out a low, mournful howl that echoed through the valley, a sound that stirred something primal in him. The pups stirred, their whines sharpening as if answering her call. Luke watched, transfixed, as the wolf's amber eyes seemed to pierce the distance, locking onto the trailer with an intensity that made his skin prick.
She was no ordinary wolf. She was their mother, he was sure of it, come to reclaim what was hers. The wolf mother moved with deliberate grace, descending the hill in slow, measured steps, her paws sinking into the snow. She stopped a few yards from the trailer, her nose twitching as she scented the air, her gaze never wavering from the door. Luke's pulse raced, his relentless PTSD whispering warnings of danger, but he couldn't look away. She didn't approach closer, only paced in a wide arc, her movements fluid yet purposeful, as if testing the boundaries of this human domain. Another howl, shorter this time, cut through the silence, and the fragile pups responded with frantic whines, their tiny bodies shifting under the blanket. Luke's throat tightened as he realized they recognized her, their instinct drawing them to the call of their kin. The wolf's patience, her lack of aggression, spoke of a deep resolve, a mother's determination to find her lost children. Luke's eyes darted to the snow around the trailer, where faint paw prints and stray strands of fur hinted at the presence of a pack. A distant howl, faint but unmistakable, drifted from the forest beyond the valley. The wolf mother was alone for now, and Luke clung to the hope that she was the pup's salvation. He pieced together the story in his mind. The poachers or hunters, like those who'd come yesterday, had likely attacked her pack, killing or scattering it, leaving her to search for her young. If she was their mother, the fragile pups had a chance to return to the wild, to the life they were born for. Luke gripped the doorframe, his emotions a tangled storm of hope and fear. The pups' whines grew louder, their small heads turning toward the door, as if they could sense her presence. He wanted them to be reunited, to run free with their mother, but the thought of letting them go was a knife in his chest. They were his purpose, his redemption, the first thing he'd fought for since Emily's death. Losing them felt like losing her again, like surrendering the fragile light he'd found in this dark world. Yet Emily's voice echoed in his memory, soft but unwavering. Do what's right, even if it hurts. Luke swallowed hard, his eyes stinging. He knew what he had to do, but the weight of it threatened to break him. The trailer's interior felt smaller now, the walls closing in as Luke stood before the door, his hand trembling on the cold metal latch. Outside, the wolf mother waited, her silver-gray form a silent sentinel in the snow. Her amber eyes fixed on the trailer, the pups' whines had grown insistent, their tiny bodies wriggling under the blanket as they strained toward the door, drawn by their mother's call. Memories of Afghanistan flooded him, gunfire, screams, the faces of men he couldn't save. His mind screamed that opening the door was madness, that the wolf could attack, that the pack could descend, that he was risking everything for creatures that weren't his. You can't keep them forever, a voice inside him whispered, sharp and unyielding. They're not yours. Luke's hands shook, sweat beating on his forehead despite the chill seeping through the door. He saw the wolf mother's howl in his mind, her patience, her resolve, and he knew she wasn't a threat, not to her pups, but the fear was real, a weight that pinned him in place, his relentless PTSD painting every possibility in shades of disaster. What if the pack was waiting, ready to tear through the valley? He thought of Scout, of the trailer, of the fragile sanctuary he'd built. Opening the door felt like inviting chaos, like stepping back into the war he'd never truly left. Yet the fragile pups' whines cut through his panic, their desperate calls a reminder of why he was here. Emily's memory rose like a beacon, her face clear in his mind's eye. He saw her releasing a deer into the forest, its legs unsteady but free, her eyes bright with tears and pride. Love means letting go, Luke, she'd said, her voice a steady flame in the darkness of his fear. Even if it breaks your heart. Luke's breath hitched, his eyes falling to the fragile pups. The stronger one was on its feet, its small body trembling as it faced the door. The weaker pup, still frail, lifted its head, its amber eyes glinting with a spark of life. They knew their mother was near, and they were calling to her, their instincts stronger than their fragility. Luke took a deep breath, his hands steadying on the latch. "For you, Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He pushed aside the fear, the PPD, the ghosts of his past, and made his choice. The door creaked open, a rush of cold air sweeping into the trailer, carrying the scent of snow and pine. Luke stepped to the side, his body tense, his eyes locked on the wolf mother. She stood motionless at the threshold, her gaze meeting his, not with aggression but with a quiet understanding, as if she sensed his role in her pup's survival. Her nose twitched, catching the scent of her young, and she moved forward, her steps slow and deliberate, her paws silent on the snow-dusted floor. The wolf mother entered the trailer, her presence filling the small space with a wild, untamed energy. Luke held his breath, his hands clenched at his sides, but he didn't interfere. She approached the fragile pups, her nose lowering to sniff them, her silver fur brushing the blankets. A low, warm rumble escaped through the room. The stronger pup let out a sharp whine, scrambling to nuzzle her, its tiny head pressing against her muzzle. The weaker pup, slower but determined, dragged itself closer, its body curling against her warmth. The mother licked them gently, her tongue cleaning their matted fur, her eyes soft with a tenderness that transcended species. Luke watched, his vision blurring with tears. The pups were frantic with joy, their whines turning to soft yips as they clung to their mother, their small bodies alive with the connection they'd been denied. The stronger pup cawed its head into her side while the weaker one nestled beneath her, its frail form sheltered by her strength. Then, as if sensing his presence, the stronger pup turned, its amber eyes meeting Luke's. For a fleeting moment, their gazes locked, and Luke felt a silent gratitude, a wordless thanks that pierced his heart. He wiped his face, tears streaming down his cheeks, the pain of letting go mingling with the relief of seeing them whole. Scout, lying quietly by the fire, watched the reunion without a sound, his eyes calm and knowing. He didn't growl, didn't stir, as if he understood the sanctity of this moment. The firelight bathed the scene, casting a warm glow over the wolf mother and her pups, transforming the trailer from a place of solitude into a space of connection. Luke felt it too, a shift in the air, as if the trailer had become a bridge between his world and theirs. He stood silent, his heart heavy but full, knowing he'd done what Emily would have wanted, what the fragile pups deserved. The wolf mother let out a soft rumble, her muzzle nudging the fragile pups gently, urging them to their feet. The stronger pup rose quickly, its small legs wobbling but eager, its yips filled with excitement as it followed her toward the door. Luke stood just outside the trailer, his arms crossed against the cold, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. The wolf mother stepped through the doorway, her silver fur catching the light, and stopped, turning her head to meet Luke's gaze. Her amber eyes held no threat, only a depth that seemed to acknowledge his role in her pup's survival. Luke nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. She led the fragile pups across the snow-dusted meadow, her steps sure and steady, their small forms bobbing behind her. The stronger pup bounded ahead, its energy uncontained, while the weaker one stayed close to her side, its frail body supported by her presence. The mother paused again, lifting her head to release a long resonant howl that echoed through the valley, a call that reached far beyond the hills. The pups responded, their weak yips trying to mimic her, their voices fragile but alive with the promise of the wild. The sound stirred something in Luke, a mix of awe and longing, as if the howl carried the soul of the forest itself. From the distant pines, a faint answering howl drifted back, a sign that the pack was near, waiting to welcome them home. The trio moved toward the forest, their figures growing smaller as they crossed the meadow, the snow crunching softly under their paws. The trees loomed ahead, their branches heavy with frost, a dark curtain that would soon swallow them from view. Luke's chest ached, his hands gripping his jacket as he watched. Then the stronger pup stopped, turning back one last time. Its amber eyes found Luke's, bright and clear in the morning light, and for a moment time seemed to pause. Luke felt the weight of their shared journey, the nights of fear and hope, the fight to keep them alive. He raised a hand, a quiet farewell, and the pup yipped once before turning to follow its mother. Luke stood rooted in place, his breath fogging in the cold as the wolf mother and her pups reached the edge of the forest. Their forms blended into the shadows of the pines, the mother's silver fur the last to fade until they were gone, swallowed by the wild they belonged to. The valley fell silent, the only sound the soft rustle of wind through the grass. Luke's heart felt hollow, as if a piece of him had vanished with them. He wiped his eyes, the tears drawing on his cheeks, and managed a faint smile. "You made it," he whispered, his voice lost in the vastness of the valley. The sun climbed higher, its light spilling over the hills, melting the frost in patches, and revealing the faint trail of paw prints leading to the forest. The valley was still, a quiet witness to the act of compassion that had unfolded within. Luke looked out, his gaze lingering on the trees, and felt a connection to the world he'd long shut out. The pups were free, their mother had found them, and in that moment Luke knew his choice had mattered. His actions, small as they were, had left a mark on the wild, a trace that would endure like the paw prints in the snow. He turned back to the trailer, the door still open, and stepped inside, ready to face whatever came next, carrying the weight of a heart that had learned to hope again. Luke Whitaker stepped back into the trailer, the door creaking on its rusty hinges as it swung shut behind him, sealing out the crisp morning air of the Wyoming Valley. The silence inside was heavy, a stark contrast to the soft whines and rustling of the wolf pups that had filled the space just moments ago. The wool blanket lay crumpled near the fireplace, its edges frayed and dusted with ash, a silent witness to the days Luke had spent fighting for the fragile pups' lives. A tin cup, its interior crusted with dried jerky paste, sat abandoned on the floor, a relic of his desperate efforts to keep them alive. The fire burned low, its embers casting a faint flickering glow across the trailer's worn walls, illuminating the faded photo of Emily on the shelf. Her smile, frozen in time, seemed to watch him, but the absence of the fragile pup's presence made the room feel colder, emptier, as if a piece of its soul had followed them into the forest. Luke's boots scuffed the floor, the sound echoing in the quiet, and he paused, his chest tight with the weight of their departure. Scout lifted his head from the corner where he'd curled up, his golden fur catching the firelight, his brown eyes heavy with a sadness that mirrored Luke's own. The dog's tail gave a single slow thump, a gesture of recognition, as if he too felt the void left by the fragile pups. Luke crossed the room, his knees creaking as he knelt beside Scout, his hand sinking into the dog's warm fur. "We gave them a chance." Scout leaned into the touch, his tongue flicking out to lick Luke's hand, a quiet comfort that eased the ache in Luke's heart. The dog's unwavering loyalty, his steady presence through the brutal storm and the hunter's threat, had been a lifeline, and Luke's fingers lingered, drawing strength from the bond they shared. He managed a faint smile, the corners of his mouth trembling, as he met Scout's gaze. "You're all I got now, boy," he said, the words carrying both gratitude and sorrow. Luke's thoughts turned inward, the trailer's silence giving space for reflection. For the first time since the war in Afghanistan, he felt a spark of purpose, a light piercing the suffocating darkness of his relentless PTSD. The nights of terror, the memories of fallen comrades, the crushing guilt of surviving when others did. Those had defined him for so long, chaining him to a life of isolation and despair. But the fragile pups had changed something. Their survival, their reunion with their mother, was a victory. Small but undeniable. Luke had altered their fate, pulled them back from the edge of death, and that act carried a weight he hadn't expected. He thought of the ditch, the frozen maw that would have claimed them, and felt a quiet pride. He'd done what he couldn't do in the war. He'd saved lives, given them a future. The pain of his past, the scars of battle still lingered, but they felt lighter now, as if the fragile pups had carried a piece of his burden into the wild. He rose, his knees protesting, and moved to the fireplace, adding a log that sent sparks dancing upward. The trailer remained cold, the wind slipping through its seams, but Luke's heart was warm, kindled by a sense of accomplishment he hadn't known in years. "You'd be proud, Emily," he said softly, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "Did what you would have done." He sat in the old chair, its springs creaking under his weight, and pulled Scout close, the dog's head resting on his knee. The pain of letting the fragile pups go still stung, a raw wound that would take time to heal, but Luke knew he'd made the right choice. He'd given them freedom, honored their wildness, and in doing so found a piece of himself he thought was lost forever. The trailer, once a refuge from the world, now felt like a place of beginnings, a space where he could start to rebuild, one small step at a time. The sun rose slowly over the Wyoming hills, its golden rays piercing the thinning veil of mist that cloaked the valley, bathing the snow-dusted landscape in a warm, forgiving light. The pine forest stood silent, its dark branches still, no longer echoing the distant howls of the wolf pack that had reclaimed its own. A gentle breeze stirred the meadow's frozen grass, whispering through the valley with a softness that felt like a benediction, and the snow, the faint paw prints of the wolf mother, and her pups traced a fading path toward the trees, their outlines softening as the morning warmth melted the fur. The marks were fleeting, like memories blending into the wild, yet they carried a quiet permanence, a testament to the journey that had unfolded in this secluded place. The valley returned to its primal stillness, bore the invisible imprint of Luke Garver's compassion, a subtle shift in its untamed heart that would linger long after the snows had gone. Luke stood outside his weather-beaten trailer, his boots crunching in the snow, his breath forming faint clouds in the crisp air. He gazed toward the forest, where the wolf mother and her pups had vanished, and a smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile he'd felt in years. The ache of their absence was still raw, a hollow space in his chest, but it was tempered by a profound peace. He knew his act of kindness had changed their fate, guiding them back to their mother, to the wild where they belonged. His PTSD, that ever-present shadow, still lurked, its tendrils coiled in the corners of his mind, but for the first time, Luke felt a spark of hope, like the sun's warmth seeping into his soul. He thought of Emily, her gentle smile vivid in his memory, and felt her presence, as if she were standing beside him, her pride a quiet affirmation of what he'd done. "You'd have loved them, Emily," he whispered, his voice steady, carrying a gratitude that reached beyond the grave. This story, born in the cold of a Wyoming blizzard, carries a timeless truth. Compassion, no matter how small, leaves traces that endure forever. His journey, marked by sacrifice and healing, reminds us that kindness can shift destinies, bridging the gap between man and nature. Let this tale be shared, a call to carry forward the values of empathy and courage, to act with heart even when the world seems cold. The paw prints in the snow, fading but never truly gone, stand as a symbol of what is possible when we choose to care. In the quiet of the valley, Luke's legacy lives on, a whisper of hope that the good we do will never fade, etched into the wild like tracks that time cannot erase. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out, hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us. Luke stood by the fading paw prints, the cold wind whispering promises of survival and healing. In their fight, he had rediscovered his own. And as the snow glistened under the early light, he knew that the wild had not only reclaimed two of its own, but had restored a broken warrior too.